Adrian Vale fears nothing in the world. Not bullets, not the police, not death. But there's one thing he never anticipated, the fear of losing the wife he once thought was just a cold contract. When Evelyn Mercer disappears from a familiar street corner, Chicago's entire underworld shakes. This is the story of a sham marriage that becomes the only thing worth the life of the city's most dangerous man. Follow the story to the end, and don't forget to like and leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. Rain hit the windshield like static, and Adrian Vale watched it without blinking. He was parked across from St. Aurelius Hospital, 3 blocks from a meeting he wasn't going to make, because his lawyer had just told him something that made every other appointment in his life irrelevant. "Say it again," Adrian said. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was the problem with people who didn't know him. They thought quiet meant calm. "The council wants you married within 90 days, Marcus said, sitting beside him with a folder he hadn't opened yet. Real marriage, public, photographed. Or they pull their support and back Castellano instead. Adrian's jaw worked once, a muscle ticking under 3 days of stubble he hadn't had time to shave. He'd buried his father 2 weeks ago. He'd buried 6 of his father's enemies in the 18 months before that, some literally. He'd inherited a kingdom built on fear, and now a room full of old men in tailored suits wanted him to play house for the cameras like that erased what he was. "They think a wife makes me safe," Adrian said. "They think a wife makes you predictable," Marcus said. "Predictable men don't get challenged. Challenged men start wars nobody wants to pay for." Adrian almost laughed. Almost. He didn't have the muscle for it anymore. Chuck hadn't in years. He looked out at the rain instead, at the gray smear of the city he now owned the underside of, and thought about how little any of it had to do with love. 3 miles south, in a walk-up apartment with a busted radiator and a window that didn't quite close, Evelyn Mercer was doing math that didn't work no matter how many times she ran it. She had the numbers spread across the kitchen table, bank statements, a casino marker with her brother's signature scratched across the bottom like a wound, a debt collection notice with a deadline circled in red pen. $41,000. Her brother Danny was 26 years old and he owed $41,000 to men who didn't send letters when payment was late. They sent visits. "I can fix this," Danny said from the doorway. He looked like hell, hollow-eyed, jittery, picking at the cuff of his sleeve the way he did when he was lying to himself before he lied to her. "I just need one more—" "Don't," Evelyn said, not looking up. "Don't say one more anything. You said one more game 4 loans ago." "They're not loans, Ev. It's not—" "I know what it is." Her voice cracked once, sharp, and she hated that it did. She was 29 years old. She had a CPA license and a job at a forensic accounting firm, where she spent her days finding the lies hidden in other people's numbers, and she could not find a way to make her own numbers stop being true. "I know exactly what it is. I've read the contract twice. They've got 6 weeks before they stop being patient." Danny sat down across from her, finally, his hands shaking slightly against the table's edge. "I'll figure it out." "You won't." She said it without cruelty, just fact, the same flat tone she used when she told clients their numbers didn't add up and never would. "You don't have $41,000, Danny, and neither do I. And Mom's pension barely covers her medication, so unless you've got a plan I don't know about—" "What if you did?" Evelyn looked up. Danny's eyes were wet now, scared in a way she hadn't seen since their father died, since it had just been the two of them figuring out how to survive a city that didn't care if you survived it. "There's a guy, a fixer. He works for people who lend money the fast way, but also for people who need things fixed. He said there's a man looking for a wife. Real marriage, pays the debt outright, gives you a monthly—" "Ev, don't look at me like that. I'm not saying do it. I'm saying it exists. It's an option that exists." "You want me to marry a stranger." "I want Danny Mercer to not end up in the river," Danny said, and his voice broke on the last word. And that was the thing that did it. Not the threat to himself, never that. He'd always been better at being scared for her than for himself, but hearing him say the river out loud, like it was a real place he'd actually pictured himself in. Evelyn closed her eyes. She thought about their mother, asleep in the next room, oxygen tank humming, no idea any of this was happening because they'd agreed a long time ago to keep her out of it. She thought about the apartment, the radiator, 6 years of school loans she still hadn't paid off. She thought about every spreadsheet she'd ever built where the bottom line simply didn't lie, no matter how badly you wanted it to. "Who's the man?" she said. Danny swallowed. "He doesn't really have a name people use out loud." Well, the meeting happened in a place that didn't look like anything. A private room above a restaurant on the north side. No sign, no name, just a door that opened when you knocked the right number of times. Evelyn wore the only blazer she owned that didn't have a coffee stain, and she sat with her hands folded on the table because she didn't trust them not to shake otherwise. Adrian Vale walked in 11 minutes late, and the room changed temperature. He wasn't what she expected. She'd built an image in her head over the 2 sleepless nights it took to arrange this. Some thick-necked caricature, gold rings, a voice like gravel. Instead, she got a man maybe 34, lean in a way that suggested violence rather than gym memberships, dressed like he was attending a funeral he didn't care about. His eyes were the wrong kind of calm, not peaceful, empty in a controlled way, like a room someone had cleaned out on purpose. "Miss Mercer," he said, sitting across from her without offering a hand. "You're a forensic accountant." "I am." "You find money people are trying to hide." "I find lies people tell with numbers," she said. "Most lies are numbers eventually." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not warmth, she wouldn't have called it warmth, but interest, the way a man might look twice at a lock he hadn't expected to be difficult. "I need a wife," Adrian said. No preamble, no softening. 3 years, minimum, public, convincing. "You'll live at my residence, you'll attend events I require, you'll wear what I tell you to wear to those events, because the people watching us notice everything, and I won't have you photographed looking like an afterthought. In exchange, I clear your brother's debt tonight, before you leave this room, and I pay you $4,000 a month on top of that for as long as the arrangement lasts." Evelyn's pulse was loud in her own ears. "And after 3 years? After 3 years, you walk away with enough money that you never have to do this again, and we never see each other. What do you get out of it? Besides, whatever it is people think a wife does for you." "Legitimacy," Adrian said. "Optics. The men I answer to want to believe I'm stable. A wife says stable. It says nothing about what I actually am, which is fine, because what I actually am isn't your concern as long as you understand the rules." "Which are?" "Separate rooms. Separate lives, mostly. You don't ask questions about my business, and I don't explain it. You don't fall in love with me, Miss Mercer, because I won't be able to love you back, and pretending otherwise will only get someone hurt." He said it the way he'd say a weather report. "If you're looking for romance, this isn't that. If you're looking for your brother to keep breathing, I can promise you that part." Evelyn looked at this stranger, at the flat, terrible certainty in his face, like a man who had made peace with being unlovable a long time ago and stopped grieving it, and thought about Danny's voice cracking on the river. "I have one condition," she said. His eyebrow moved, barely. "You're not really in a position to—" "I have one condition," she said again, steadier this time, because if she was going to do this, she was not going to do it on her knees. "My mother doesn't know any of this. Not the debt, not the marriage, not what I'm trading to fix it. As far as she knows, I met a good man and fell in love. You don't correct that. Not to her, not to anyone who might tell her." For a long moment, Adrian just looked at her, and something in his expression rearranged itself slightly, like he'd recalibrated an estimate. "Done," he said. The wedding was small, fast, and entirely without joy. A courthouse ceremony witnessed by Marcus and a woman Evelyn would later learn was Adrian's housekeeper, Rosa, who cried a little anyway, out of habit more than feeling. Evelyn wore a dress she'd bought off the rack that morning. Adrian didn't smile in a single photograph, and neither did she. And the judge looked at both of them like he'd married worse, and not blinked. That night, Adrian's driver took her to the estate for the first time. A converted industrial property out past the rail yards, walled, gated, with cameras mounted at angles that made it clear someone had thought hard about who might want in. The house itself was enormous and almost entirely empty of personality, like a hotel suite that had been lived in by someone too tired to decorate it. Marble floors that echoed, a kitchen the size of her old apartment, untouched, gleaming, sterile. "Your room," Adrian said, leading her up a staircase wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast without touching. He opened a door at the far end of a hallway. Opposite end from his own, she noted, a calculated distance. Rosa stalked it with what she guessed your size to be. If anything's wrong, tell her she'll fix it. Dinner's at 7 if you want it. Optional if you don't. There's a man named Tomas posted outside the gate, and another named Felix who rotates the interior. They'll have your photograph by tomorrow morning. They won't bother you, but you should know who they are so you're not startled. How many people work here? Enough, Adrian said, which wasn't an answer, and they both seemed to understand it wasn't meant to be one. He left her standing in a room with a 4-poster bed she'd never sleep fully in, not for months, because some nervous system deep in her body refused to believe she was safe enough to. She sat on the edge of the mattress after he was gone and finally let her hands shake the way they'd wanted to all day. And she didn't cry, because crying felt like something she'd earned the right to stop doing a long time ago, somewhere around her father's funeral, somewhere around the first time she'd had to be the calm one for Danny instead of the other way around. She thought, 3 years. She thought, Danny's debt is gone. She thought distantly about the man downstairs who'd looked at her like a problem he'd successfully solved, filed, closed. She didn't think about how she'd feel about him in 6 months. She had no reason to believe there'd be anything to feel. The first month was exactly what he'd promised. Theater, performed competently and without warmth. They appeared together at 2 events, his hand at the small of her back in a way that read as possessive to onlookers and felt to her like a stage direction. He introduced her with the same 3 sentences each time. She smiled with the same trained precision she'd once used pitching audit findings to nervous CFOs. But Evelyn had never been a woman who could sit still inside emptiness. It wasn't in her. 3 weeks in, she found herself standing in the cavernous, unused kitchen at 6 in the morning because she couldn't sleep, and the silence of her room had started to feel less like privacy and more like a held breath, and she did the only thing that had ever calmed her. She started cooking. By the second week of that, Rosa had stopped trying to shoo her out and started handing her ingredients instead. By the 3rd week, she knew the names of the 4 men who rotated the front gate and the 2 who watched the perimeter at night, and she'd learned that Felix took his coffee with too much sugar and pretended he didn't, and that Tomas had a daughter he hadn't seen in 4 years because of choices he didn't talk about and clearly regretted with his whole chest. "You don't have to do this," Adrian told her one night, finding her at the kitchen counter at nearly midnight, flour on her wrists, a tray of something cooling that smelled like it belonged to someone's childhood. He looked at the tray, then at her, with an expression she couldn't categorize. "The arrangement doesn't require you to feed my security detail." "I'm not doing it for the arrangement," Evelyn said, not looking up from the dough she was working. "I'm doing it because I can't stand being in a house this big with nothing in my hands." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to bake," he said finally, like it cost him something to say it. "Before." Before what? Before it stopped mattering whether she did. He didn't elaborate, and his face closed the way a door closes when someone's decided the conversation's over, and Evelyn, who had spent her whole career learning to read what people didn't say in the numbers they did, filed that away without pushing. It became a pattern, those midnight kitchen encounters, neither of them naming it as anything. He'd come down restless, unable to sleep, drawn by light under a door he hadn't expected to be occupied. She'd be elbow deep in something that needed kneading, something with a beginning and an end and a result she could control, which was more than she could say for the rest of her life lately. They didn't talk about the marriage, they talked about nothing. A case she was working, a building he was trying to acquire, the absurd story of how Felix had once fallen asleep standing up during a 6-hour watch, and nobody had told him for a week because it was too funny not to let ride. She started to notice things. The way his shoulders dropped half an inch when he thought no one was watching, the way he flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the sound of a door slamming too hard, like his body remembered something his face refused to, the way he never, not once, raised his voice at staff. Quiet correction instead, precise, almost gentle, which didn't track with anything she'd heard about him before she'd signed a single document. "You're not what they say you are," she told him once, the words out before she'd decided to say them. Adrian didn't look up from the report he was reading. "I'm exactly what they say I am. You've just only seen the part of it that isn't pointed at you. It should have scared her more than it did. The gala was Adrian's idea, or rather his obligation, an annual fundraiser thrown by the Mafia Council's legitimate front, a charity for children's hospitals that laundered roughly 40% of its donations, attended by every major player in the Midwest underworld, dressed up like they ran banks instead of territories. Adrian needed to be seen there. He needed Evelyn seen there beside him, finally, fully, no more half measures. Rosa had the emerald dress delivered 3 days prior, and when Evelyn put it on, she barely recognized the woman in the mirror, not because the dress transformed her into someone else, but because for the first time in months she looked like someone who'd stopped merely surviving and started, despite everything, actually existing. Adrian's reaction when she came downstairs was a held breath and nothing else. No words, just a half-second of stillness that told her more than a compliment would have. "You look," he started, and then didn't finish it, like the sentence wasn't built for him. "It's fine," Evelyn said, half smiling, letting him off the hook because making him finish sentences he wasn't built for felt, suddenly, like something she didn't want to do to him. The gala was a glittering, gold-lit horror show of people Evelyn had only read about in the financial filings she dug through for a living. Men whose holding companies she could have unraveled in an afternoon if anyone had ever asked her to. Women dripping in jewelry bought with money that had passed through 6 shell corporations to get clean. She stood beside Adrian, his hand warm at the small of her back, and performed the role she'd been hired to perform. It went well for 2 hours. 2 good, almost normal hours, where Adrian introduced her to men who looked at her like she was furniture, and she charmed them anyway out of pure professional habit, where she caught him watching her across the room once with an expression that wasn't part of the performance at all. Then Silas Draven found them at the bar. Evelyn didn't know the name yet, wouldn't learn the weight of it until later, but she knew the type instantly, the way you know a bad number before you finish the calculation. A big man, soft in the face but hard in the eyes, the kind of confidence that came from never once in his life having been told no by someone who meant it. "Vale," Silas's voice carried deliberately. "Heard you finally settled down. Didn't believe it till I saw it." His eyes dragged over Evelyn, slow, insulting in their thoroughness. "This her? Christ, Adrian, I figured the Dominion Syndicate could afford something with more—" He paused for effect, smiling at his own cruelty. "Substance. She looks like she'd snap in half if you breathed wrong on her. World like ours, a woman that fragile's a liability, not a wife." The ballroom didn't go silent immediately. It went silent in pieces, conversation by conversation, as people registered what had just been said and to whom. Evelyn felt heat climb her neck. Not embarrassment, something closer to fury, old and familiar. The same fury she'd felt every time a client's husband had talked over her in a boardroom, every time someone had mistaken her quiet for weak. She opened her mouth to say something sharp, something that would have cut Silas Draven into smaller, more accurate pieces than he deserved. Adrian moved before she finished the thought. It wasn't fast in the way movies made violence fast. It was almost unhurried, which somehow made it worse. Adrian setting his glass down without spilling a drop, crossing the 4 feet between himself and Silas Draven, with the calm, unbothered gait of a man walking to greet an old friend. And then his hand was fisted in the back of Silas's collar, and Silas's face was meeting the marble edge of the bar with a sound that emptied the room of every other sound that existed. Silas made a noise that wasn't a word. Blood hit the white marble in a fine spray. "Apologize to my wife," Adrian said. Quiet, almost gentle. The worst kind of voice, Evelyn understood now, the kind that didn't need volume because it had never needed to ask twice for anything in its life. Silas, pinned, bleeding from a split brow, managed something that might have been an apology if you were feeling generous about consonants. "Louder," Adrian said. "She didn't hear you." "I'm sorry," Silas got out, the word dragged from somewhere humiliating. "Sorry, apologies, Mrs. Vale." Adrian held him there one more second, long enough to make sure every single person in that ballroom understood it wasn't theater, and then released him like he was dropping something he'd lost interest in. Silas crumpled, caught himself against a bar stool, didn't look at anyone as he was helped away by men with the particular stillness of people who'd just watched their boss's reputation take a permanent hit. Adrian turned back to Evelyn. His knuckles were split, a thin line of red threading down between his fingers, and he didn't seem to notice it at all. What he noticed was her face, and whatever he found there made something shift behind his eyes that she'd never seen on him before. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something closer to fear, like a man realizing too late how much he'd just revealed. "You didn't have to do that," Evelyn said, quiet, just for him. "Yes," Adrian said. "I did." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. She understood it the way she understood numbers, instantly, completely, in a way that didn't require translation. Something had stopped being a performance somewhere in the last 3 weeks, somewhere between midnight kitchens and a man telling her about a mother who used to bake before it stopped mattering. She didn't know exactly when. She only knew that the marriage on paper and the marriage in his eyes had quietly, dangerously become two very different documents, and only one of them had been signed with witnesses. That night, in the car, Adrian held her hand the entire drive home, and neither of them said a single word about it, and neither of them let go. What neither of them understood, what neither of them could have understood, sealed inside that car, inside that one perfect, terrible night, was that every man in that ballroom had just watched Adrian Vale show the entire Midwest exactly where his heart now lived. And somewhere in the wreckage of his pride, nursing a broken nose and a debt of humiliation he intended to repay in full, Silas Draven had already started thinking about exactly how he was going to make Adrian Vale pay for it. Not through Adrian, through her. Lên kế hoạch viết phần tiếp theo với xung đột leo thang và kết thúc ngoạc. Lên kế hoạch viết phần tiếp theo với xung đột leo thang và kết thúc ngoạc. 3 days after the gala. The split on Adrian's knuckles had scabbed over, but the silence in the house hadn't healed at all. Evelyn noticed it first in the mornings. Adrian gone before she woke, back after she'd already given up waiting for dinner. A man retreating into the version of himself that existed before a marble bar, and a public apology had rewritten the terms of whatever they were doing. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself a lot of things that week that didn't survive contact with the actual silence of that house. She found him on the 4th night in his office, door cracked, lamp throwing one cone of yellow light across a desk buried in surveillance photographs. She almost didn't go in. Then she saw her own face in one of the photos. Grainy, taken from across the street, her walking out of the bakery 2 blocks from the estate with a paper bag in her hand, and something cold dropped through her stomach. "Why is there a picture of me leaving Halstead Bakery?" she said. Adrian didn't look up immediately. When he did, his face had the flat, controlled stillness she now recognized as the mask he wore when something underneath it was anything but controlled. "Sit down." "I'm not sitting down." "Why do you have surveillance photos of me?" "Because Silas Draven has been having you followed for 3 days, Adrian said, and the words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. My men noticed his men noticing you. So now I have men photographing his men photographing you. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked. I should have told you the first day." Evelyn's pulse climbed into her throat. "Why is he following me?" "Because he can't get to me," Adrian said. "Because his pride's been bleeding since I put his face into a bar in front of half the council, and men like Silas don't let that go. They convert it into leverage, into a plan." He rubbed a hand down his face, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw real exhaustion on him, not the performed kind. "I've doubled the rotation on the gate. Felix is on you whenever you leave the property. You don't go anywhere alone starting tonight. You don't get to decide that unilaterally." "I just did." "That's not how this is supposed to work." Evelyn's voice cracked up half an octave, sharper than she meant. 3 years? Separate lives? You don't ask questions about my business? That was the deal. The deal didn't say I get a babysitter because you embarrassed a man at a party. Something flared behind Adrian's eyes, fast and ugly. "I didn't embarrass him. I corrected him. There's a difference, and the difference is the only reason you're not currently sitting in a basement somewhere with a bag over your head. So forgive me if I don't apologize for assigning you protection." "Don't yell at me." "I'm not yelling." He was, a little, and they both knew it, and the knowing made it worse. He caught himself, exhaled through his nose, dropped his voice back down into that controlled register that scared her more than shouting ever could. I'm telling you what's true. You wanted to know why there's a photograph of you on my desk. That's why. I'd rather you be angry at me and alive than comfortable and not. Evelyn stood there with her arms crossed over a body that wouldn't stop shaking slightly. Adrenaline with nowhere to go. You should have told me the moment you knew. I'm telling you now. That's not the same thing, Adrian. She said his first name like an accusation, which, in that house, it basically was. They didn't use first names, not really, not outside the script they performed for other people. You don't get to manage me. I've spent my whole life being the only person taking care of myself. I'm not going to sit in this enormous house and let you decide what I'm allowed to know about my own danger. Then what do you want? He said. And for once it didn't sound rhetorical. It sounded like he genuinely didn't know. Like the question had cost him something to ask. Tell me what you want, Evelyn, because I am trying, and I don't know what trying looks like to you. The use of her actual name, not Miss Mercer, not Mrs. Vale, just Evelyn, raw and unrehearsed, knocked something loose in her chest that she didn't have time to examine, because right then Rosa appeared in the doorway, face pale under the hallway light. Mr. Vale? Rosa's voice was tight. Marcus is on the phone. He says it's urgent. He says it's about Danny. Danny Mercer had been picked up outside a bar on the west side 2 hours earlier, not by police, by two men nobody recognized who'd put a gun against his ribs and walked him into a car like it was the easiest thing in the world. And then, 20 minutes later, dropped him back on the same corner with a message and a face that needed 6 stitches above the eye. Evelyn found him in the estate's medical room. Yes, the house had a medical room, another fact she hadn't known until tonight, with a retired trauma nurse named Conchita, who lived 2 miles away and came whenever Rosa called, sitting on the edge of a gurney with a bag of ice against his face and his hands shaking around a paper cup of water he wasn't drinking. Danny. She crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed his face in both hands, tilting it toward the light, checking the stitches Conchita had already closed. What happened? Who did this? It was Draven's people, Danny said, and his voice was wrecked, thin. They didn't even want money. They knew exactly who I was the second they grabbed me. Said to tell you something. Said to tell you exactly, word for word. Tell me what? Danny's eyes filled, and he looked suddenly exactly like he had at 9 years old, the year their father died, the year Evelyn had stopped being someone's little sister and started being the last reliable adult in both their lives. He said, tell Adrian Vale's bride that her brother's face was a warning, and the next time it won't be a warning, it'll be a delivery. The room went very quiet. Adrian had come in behind her. She hadn't heard him, but she felt the temperature change, the way the air in a room shifts when something genuinely dangerous enters it. And when she turned, his face had gone past anger into somewhere colder and stiller, a place she recognized now as the real Adrian Vale, the one the rest of the city was actually afraid of. Get him a room here, Adrian said to Marcus, who'd materialized in the doorway with a phone still pressed to his ear. Tonight. Permanently, until this is over. I want 2 men on the mother's apartment by morning. Discreet. She's not to know why. You can't just relocate my entire family, Evelyn said, but the protest came out hollow even to her own ears, because what was the alternative? Leaving Danny out there for the next visit, the one that wouldn't end with stitches. I can, and I am, and you're going to let me, Adrian said, because the alternative is burying your brother, and I am not interested in watching that happen to you over a turf war that has nothing to do with him. It has everything to do with him, Danny said, miserable ice bag slipping from his hand. It's because of me. The debt. That's how this started, isn't it? I'm the reason she's in this house in the first place. I'm the reason any of this is happening. Danny, don't... No, it's true, Ev. You wouldn't have married a stranger if I hadn't... His voice broke entirely, and Evelyn pulled him into her arms the way she had 100 times since they were kids, his shoulders shaking under her hands, and over his head she met Adrian's eyes, and something passed between them that wasn't anger anymore. It was closer to grief. Closer to 2 people standing at the edge of something they could both see coming and couldn't yet name. Marcus pulled Adrian into the hallway 20 minutes later, voice low, urgent. The kind of low that meant he didn't want it carrying. This isn't random, Marcus said. Draven's been quiet for 3 days, which means he's been planning, not licking his wounds. Grabbing the brother and letting him go, that's not an attack, Adrian. That's a message. He's telling you he can reach anyone connected to you whenever he wants. He's establishing reach before he uses it. I know what it is. Do you? Because you've got a face on right now I haven't seen since your father's funeral, and I need you thinking clearly, not, I am thinking clearly. Adrian's voice was low, controlled, terrifyingly even. I'm thinking that I have a wife inside this house I told would be safe inside this arrangement, and a man who took a public humiliation from me 3 days ago is now systematically proving he can hurt everything I touch without touching me at all. That's clear thinking, Marcus. That's the clearest I've thought in years. Marcus studied him for a long moment. You weren't supposed to fall for her. The words landed somewhere Adrian wasn't ready for. I haven't fallen for anyone. You broke a man's face in front of the council for looking at her wrong. Marcus's voice wasn't unkind, just tired, just honest in the particular way only 20 years of friendship bought you. You've got a security detail rerouted around her schedule. You're standing in a hallway right now looking like you'd burn the entire West Side down rather than let something happen to her. I've known you since we were 19, Adrian. I know what you look like when you don't care about something. This isn't that. Adrian didn't answer. The silence answered for him, and they both knew it, and Marcus, wisely, didn't push it further. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She sat in the chair beside the bed where Danny had finally drifted off, exhausted, the ice bag fallen to the floor, and she watched the rise and fall of his chest like she used to when he was small and feverish, and their mother had been too tired from double shifts to stay up worrying properly. So the worrying had fallen to Evelyn instead, the way most things eventually fell to Evelyn. Around 2 a.m, Adrian found her there. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood in the doorway, and then he crossed the room and pulled a second chair up beside hers, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and they sat together in the dark, watching her brother breathe. I'm sorry, he said finally, quiet, the words coming out rougher than she'd ever heard from him. I should have told you the threat existed the moment my men flagged it. I let pride get in the way of your safety, and your brother paid for that. That's on me. It's not your fault Silas Draven is a psychopath. It's my fault he has a reason to be one-pointed at your family. Adrian's jaw was tight, his hands clasped between his knees, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked young, not in years, but in something else, some exhausted, unguarded register he usually kept locked down under all that careful stillness. I told you, the day we met, that I wouldn't be able to love you back. I told you that like it was a kindness, like I was protecting you from disappointment. He shook his head once, almost to himself. I don't think that was honest. I think I was protecting myself. Evelyn's breath caught. Adrian, you don't have to say anything, he said quickly, like he regretted it the second it left him, like a man who'd revealed more of his hand than he'd meant to. I just needed you to know it wasn't a lie I told on purpose. It was a lie I believed, until it wasn't true anymore, and I don't know exactly when that happened. They sat in silence after that, close enough to feel each other's warmth, neither one reaching across the last 6 inches between them, both too exhausted and too frightened by what those 6 inches had quietly come to mean. 2 weeks passed in a state of low-grade siege. Danny stayed at the estate, healing, restless, increasingly guilt-sick over what he'd brought into his sister's life. Evelyn's mother was relocated under a story about renovations to her building, a lie that cost Evelyn something every time she had to repeat it over the phone. Her mother's voice on the other end so trusting it made her chest hurt. And Adrian changed. Not toward Evelyn, toward everyone else. He grew sharper, faster to anger, prone to long silences in his office with maps spread across the desk, men rotating in and out at all hours with reports that made his face go grim and still. Evelyn watched the toll of it on him, the hollows deepening under his eyes, a tremor in his hand around his coffee cup some mornings that he tried to hide and couldn't quite. You're not sleeping, she told him one night, finding him at the kitchen counter again, the old ritual resurrected under new and worse circumstances. Neither are you. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Marcus thinks Draven's planning something bigger than a warning. He's been moving men, calling in favors with 2 crews that owe him from before my father's time. I've got people watching every angle I can think of, and it still doesn't feel like enough. What can I do? Stay inside the gates. It came out harder than he meant it, she could tell, and he caught himself, softened. Please, I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to keep the only thing in this house that isn't already poisoned by what I am. You're not poison, Adrian. I buried a man's face in marble in front of 40 witnesses, he said. 3 weeks ago, I would have called that Tuesday. You make me want to call it something else, and I don't know what to do with that, because the world I live in doesn't have room for it. Silas Draven doesn't care what I want to call it. He's already decided how to use it against me. Evelyn reached across the counter and took his hand, the one with the tremor, and held it still between both of hers. And Adrian let her, which from a man like him, she was beginning to understand, was its own kind of confession. I'm not afraid of you, she said. You should be a little, he said, but his thumb moved against her knuckles, slow, almost involuntary, and neither of them pulled away. The break came on a Tuesday, mundane in every way that mattered until it wasn't. Evelyn had been cooped up inside the gates for 16 days, and the walls, gorgeous, marble, suffocating, had started closing in on her in a way she recognized from childhood, from too many nights locked inside a too small apartment with a sick mother and a scared brother and nowhere safe to put her own fear. She needed 5 minutes that belonged only to her. She needed bread that didn't taste like anxiety. I'm going to Halstead Bakery, she told Felix, who'd been assigned to her like a second shadow for 2 weeks straight. 15 minutes. You can stand outside the door the entire time. I don't care. I just need to walk somewhere that isn't this house. Mr. Vale said, Mr. Vale isn't here, and I am an adult woman, and I am asking you, not asking permission. Her voice came out sharper than she meant, 16 days of fear curdling into something that looked from the outside like simple stubbornness. 15 minutes, Felix. I'll buy you something too. Felix, 26 years old and not remotely equipped to argue with the boss's wife when she got that look in her eye, finally relented, on the condition he walked beside her the entire way and texted Tomas their route in real time. The bakery was 4 blocks. It smelled like flour and yeast and something close to normalcy. And for 3 full minutes, standing in line behind an old man buying rye bread, Evelyn let herself believe the last 2 weeks had been a fever dream, that nothing outside this small, warm room could touch her. Then Felix's phone buzzed, and his face changed, and he said her name in a voice that made the hair on her arms stand up before he'd even finished the sentence. Mrs. Vale, we need to go, right now. The front window of the bakery shattered inward. It happened too fast for screaming to organize itself properly. Glass spraying across the display case. The old man with the rye bread dropping flat with the instinct of someone who'd heard that sound before. Felix's hand closing hard around Evelyn's arm and yanking her down behind the counter a half second before the second shot took out the espresso machine in a hiss of steam and shattered porcelain. Stay down, Felix barked, gun already in his hand, voice gone flat and professional in a way that terrified her more than the gunfire had. Stay down! Do not move! There were no more shots. That was the part that confused her, crouched there with glass in her hair and her heart slamming against her ribs. The shooting stopped almost as soon as it started, which meant it had never been meant to kill anyone. It had been meant to clear a path. She heard the door at the back of the bakery, the one that led to the alley, splinter open. She turned her head, glass biting into her palm where she'd braced herself against the floor, and saw 2 men in dark clothes already moving toward her with the calm practiced speed of men who'd done this exact thing before. And Felix turning, gun rising, too slow, always going to be too slow against 2 men who'd planned for exactly this moment. The last thing Evelyn registered with total clarity before a gloved hand closed over her mouth and something sharp-smelling pressed to a cloth against her nose dragged the world sideways into static was Felix's body hitting the tile floor of the bakery with a sound she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life, and a voice, low, almost gentle, speaking directly into her ear as her vision narrowed to a single tunnel of light. Tell Adrian Vale, the voice said, that Silas Draven says hello. And then there was nothing at all. Adrian got the call 4 minutes after it happened, and the 4 minutes before that, the 4 minutes he spent not knowing, would haunt him longer than almost anything else that followed. He was in his office, going over a shipment manifest with Marcus, when his phone lit up with Felix's name and a single word filled the screen before the call connected. Emergency. He answered on the first ring. What he got instead of Felix's voice was Tomas, breathless, running, the sound of sirens already bleeding into the background. Bakery, Tomas said. Halstead. Felix is down. There's blood everywhere. She's gone. Adrian, she's not here. They took her. The phone left Adrian's hand before he understood his fingers had let go of it. It hit the floor and he didn't pick it up. He didn't move at all, for 1 full second, 2. And Marcus, who had known him for 20 years, who had stood beside him at his father's funeral and watched him not cry, who had never once seen Adrian Vale lose the careful architecture of his own face, watched something in that face simply collapse. Then it rebuilt itself into something Marcus had also never seen before. And it was worse. Get the car, Adrian said. His voice had no temperature in it at all. Get every man we have. Get me Halstead Street in 4 minutes. The bakery looked like a crime scene because it was one. Glass everywhere, the espresso machine in pieces, a dark stain spreading across white tile where Felix had gone down. He was alive, barely. A bullet grazed along his ribs and a head wound from where he'd hit the counter on his way to the floor. Paramedics already working on him when Adrian arrived. But Adrian didn't go to him first. He went to the spot on the floor where Evelyn had been. He crouched there, in glass, and found a single earring, small, gold, one she'd been wearing that morning, knocked loose somewhere in the chaos, and he held it in his closed fist hard enough that the post drew blood from his palm, and he didn't notice that either. Talk to me, he said, not looking up, and Marcus understood the question wasn't for him. 2 men, back door, Thomas said, kneeling beside Felix, voice shaking. Front window was a distraction. Shots weren't aimed at anyone, they were aimed at clearing the room. Felix went down fighting them offer, took a graze and a head hit. Witnesses say they had her out the alley in under 90 seconds. Professional. This wasn't muscle, Adrian. This was a team. Draven's team. Had to be. Adrian stood. The earring stayed locked in his fist. Then Draven just declared a war he doesn't understand. He's already lost. They found the message 20 minutes later, taped to the inside of the bakery's shattered front door, where it would have been visible from the street the moment the first responders arrived, which meant Silas Draven had wanted it seen by everyone, not just Adrian, wanted it broadcast, wanted the entire underworld of Chicago to understand exactly what kind of man had just been embarrassed in front of them, and exactly how he intended to answer for it. The note was short. Marcus read it aloud because Adrian's hands were shaking too hard to hold the paper steady. Vale, you took my face in front of the council. I'm taking your queen in front of the city. Midnight tomorrow. Surrender the Dominion territory. Every block, every contract, signed over to me, or you get her back 1 finger at a time, starting with the one that's wearing your ring. Bring police, bring the council, bring anyone, and the deal's off before it starts. SD. The room went silent in a way that had weight to it, that pressed against the eardrums. 24 hours, Marcus said, finally, carefully, watching Adrian's face for the explosion he was certain was coming. It didn't come the way he expected. Adrian's voice, when it returned, was perfectly level. Too level, the kind of calm that frightened people who knew him well, because it meant the panic had finished arriving and something colder had taken its place. He thinks I'm going to negotiate, Adrian said. Adrian, he thinks there's a version of this where I sit at a table and discuss terms like a businessman who values territory more than he values her. Adrian folded the note once, twice, with hands gone perfectly steady now, and put it in his jacket pocket like something he intended to keep. He's about to learn how badly he's misjudged what I value. Back at the estate, the house had transformed in the space of an hour from a fortress into a war room. Maps unrolled across every flat surface. Men Evelyn had never met. Men who didn't live there. Men summoned from corners of the organization she hadn't known existed. Moved through the halls with the grim efficiency of people preparing for something they'd trained their whole lives for and hoped never to actually do. Danny found Adrian in the office at 1 a.m, pale, his stitches still raw, guilt eating through him visibly. "This is because of me," he said. "If they hadn't grabbed me first, if I hadn't brought this whole thing into her life in the first place." "Stop." Adrian didn't look up from the satellite image he was studying. An industrial property on the south side, a warehouse complex Marcus's intelligence had flagged as one of 3 locations Draven controlled with the security infrastructure to hold a hostage. "This isn't about whose fault it is. Whose fault it is doesn't get her out of that building. Sit down or get out of my way. Those are the only 2 things you're useful for right now." Danny sat down. He looked, for the first time since Adrian had met him, like a man capable of being useful instead of merely sorry. It was Marcus who said the thing nobody else wanted to say, an hour later, voice low, pulling Adrian aside from the cluster of men poring over the warehouse blueprints. "We need to talk about how he knew." Adrian's eyes came up sharp. "Knew what?" "How Draven's men knew exactly which bakery, exactly which day, exactly which 15-minute window she'd be unguarded enough to grab," Marcus said, and every word came out like he hated saying it. "Felix didn't even decide to take her there until that morning. She asked him on impulse. There's no way Draven's surveillance caught that in real time and assembled a team fast enough to hit a moving 15-minute window unless someone told him in advance," Adrian finished, and the room around them seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Someone inside," Marcus said. "Someone who knew her patterns. Someone close." Adrian's jaw worked. He thought of every face in that house. Rosa, who'd known Evelyn 3 weeks and already loved her like a daughter. Tomas, who'd bled loyalty to Adrian's family since before Adrian could walk. Conchita, the nurse, barely involved enough to know anything worth selling. And Felix, lying in a hospital bed right now with a bullet graze along his ribs that he hadn't needed to take if he'd simply stepped aside. "Felix took a bullet for her," Adrian said slowly. "Men don't take bullets to sell out the people they're protecting." "Unless the bullet was the price of looking clean afterward," Marcus said, and watched the words land like a blade going in slow. "I'm not saying it's him. I'm saying we don't rule anyone out. Not right now. Not with 23 hours on the clock and her life on the table." They went to the hospital at 2 in the morning. Felix was awake, bandaged, gray-faced, an IV running into the back of his hand, and when Adrian walked into the room, alone, having told Marcus to wait outside, because some conversations needed to happen without an audience, Felix's eyes went wide with something that looked convincingly like relief. "Boss, thank God. Is she... Where's your phone, Felix?" The question landed wrong, and Felix's face shifted, confusion sliding towards something more careful. "What?" "Your phone. The one you carry on shift. Where is it?" "It's... I don't know, evidence bag probably. The paramedics took everything when they..." Felix tried to sit up and winced hard, hand going to his ribs. "Adrian, what is this? I got shot trying to protect her? I don't understand why you're..." "You got shot," Adrian said, voice flat, terrible, "in a graze along the ribs that put you down for exactly as long as it took 2 professionals to clear a building in 90 seconds. You've done close protection for me for 3 years, Felix. You've taken worse hits in training and stayed standing. I need you to explain to me why a graze that shallow dropped you flat on a tile floor at the exact moment they needed you flat on a tile floor." The silence that followed had a physical weight to it. Felix's jaw worked, his eyes wide, wet, scared in a way that Adrian, watching for it now, couldn't tell was fear of being caught or fear of being wrongly accused, moved between Adrian's face and the door, like he was measuring distance he had no ability to cross with an IV in his arm. "You think I sold her out," Felix said, finally, voice cracking. "After 3 years. After everything your family's done for mine. You think I think someone in that house gave Draven a 15-minute window. Nobody outside the 4 walls of my home could have predicted," Adrian said. "I think you were standing 6 feet from her when it happened, and walked away with a wound shallow enough to heal in 2 weeks. I think you need to give me a better answer than outrage, Felix, because right now outrage is what guilty men perform when they don't have anything real to offer." "My sister," Felix said, and the word came out broken, and something in Adrian's chest went still and cold, because that single word told him everything before the rest of the sentence arrived. "They have my sister, 3 days ago. They sent me a photo of her tied to a chair in some basement, and told me if I didn't feed them her schedule, they'd... He was crying now, openly, the IV line trembling with the shake of his hand. I didn't want her hurt, Adrian. I swear to you I never wanted Evelyn hurt. I told them the window because I thought if I cooperated, they'd just grab her clean. No shooting, no one gets hurt, and then I'd find a way to fix it. I'd tell you everything the second it was over. I was going to tell you tonight. You were going to tell me after, Adrian said, and his voice had gone somewhere Marcus would not have recognized, somewhere past anger into a kind of devastated, surgical calm. After they already had her, after the window was already used. That's not loyalty falling apart under pressure, Felix. That's betrayal with a conscience attached, and the conscience doesn't change what it cost. What was I supposed to do? Felix said, sobbing now, raw. She's my sister. She's 17 years old. They said they'd kill her on a video call if I didn't. You were supposed to come to me. Adrian's voice cracked on the last word, the only crack in it the entire conversation, and it was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. You were supposed to trust that I would have moved heaven and earth to get your sister back without costing me my wife. Instead, you made a calculation. You decided whose life mattered more, and you decided without telling me, and now I have 22 hours to get her out of wherever Draven's holding her before he starts sending fingers instead of photographs. Felix had nothing left to say. He just wept, an IV trembling in his hand, a guilty conscience finally catching up to a decision that could not be unmade by confession alone. Adrian stood there a long moment, looking at a man he'd trusted for 3 years, feeling something in his chest tear cleanly in half. Not just rage, though there was rage, enormous and barely caged, but grief too, the specific grief of watching someone you'd called family reveal that loyalty had a price after all, that everyone, it turned out, had a price. Even the ones you'd have bet your life weren't capable of one. Where's your sister being held? Adrian said. Tell me everything you know, right now, every detail, every name, every location they mentioned, and I will use every resource I have to get her out too. Not because I forgive you, Felix, I don't, not tonight, maybe not ever, but because she's innocent in this, the way Evelyn's innocent in this, and I'm done letting Silas Draven turn innocent people into leverage. What Felix gave them changed everything. His sister, it turned out, wasn't being held at a separate location at all. Draven's organization was smaller and more consolidated than Adrian's intelligence had estimated. Overextended, in fact, having borrowed muscle from 2 outside crews just to mount the operation against Evelyn, which meant he didn't have the manpower to run 2 hostage sites simultaneously. Felix's sister was being held in the same industrial complex, the same warehouse Marcus had already flagged on the satellite images, just in a separate office block on the 2nd floor, which meant Evelyn and a terrified 17-year-old girl were being held 30 feet apart by a man who had no idea Adrian now knew exactly where to find both of them. This changes the math, Marcus said, hunched over the blueprints with new urgency. All earlier suspicion of Felix burned away by the sheer tactical value of what he'd just handed them. If we go in clean, fast, before he expects it, Draven's banking on us negotiating, on us showing up at midnight playing by his rules. He's not expecting us before then. That gap is the only advantage we've got. Then we don't wait for midnight, Adrian said. Adrian, going in early means going in without full intel on his numbers, his exits, his... Going in late means giving Silas Draven 8 more hours to decide patience isn't worth the wait, Adrian said. He's already sent 1 message in blood. I'm not waiting around to see what the second one looks like. He looked at the blueprint, at the warehouse laid out in cold blue lines, at the small office block on the 2nd floor, where 2 innocent women were being held by men who'd already proven they didn't care what it cost to hurt them, and something settled into his chest that Marcus recognized from years ago. From before Adrian had learned to wear stillness like armor, from the early days when his father was still alive, and Adrian was still just a young man learning exactly how far he'd go to protect the people who mattered to him. Get every man we have, Adrian said. Get the arsenal open. Get Danny somewhere safe, locked down, no arguments. And Marcus, he looked up, and his eyes had gone past cold into something closer to absolute. Tell every soldier in this house that tonight isn't about territory, tonight isn't about the council, or Draven's pride, or anything that mattered to me yesterday. Tonight there is exactly one objective, and every man who walks out that door with me needs to understand it before he picks up a weapon. What's the objective? Marcus said, though he already knew the answer before Adrian said it. We bring her home, Adrian said. Whatever that costs. Whoever it costs. She comes home tonight, or none of us come home at all. Inside that warehouse, 30 feet of concrete and steel away from a teenage girl crying into a dirty pillowcase someone had tied around her own wrists, Evelyn Mercer was waking up on a cold metal chair, with her hands bound behind her, and the taste of chemical sedative still thick on her tongue, blinking against a single bare bulb swinging gently overhead, and the first clear thought that surfaced through the fog was not fear, it was math. She counted the support beams. She counted the exits she could see from this angle. She counted the men. 3, that she could make out, one bored, one young and nervous, one watching her with the patient, unbothered attention of a man who'd done this before and would do it again. And somewhere underneath the terror, underneath the ache in her shoulders from hours bound in one position, the forensic accountant who'd spent her career finding the lie hidden inside someone else's numbers began, very quietly, very methodically, to look for the flaw in this room. The bored one's name, Evelyn learned by listening, was Curtis. The nervous one never got named, not where she could hear it, but he kept checking his phone like he was waiting for permission to feel something other than scared. The third man, the patient one, sat on an overturned crate by the door and cleaned his nails with a knife he clearly enjoyed owning, and he was the one she watched closest, because he was the one who'd actually kill her if it came to that without his pulse changing. She'd worked the zip tie against the chair's aluminum edge for what felt like an hour, small motions, wrist rotating a fraction of an inch at a time, disguised under the cover of shivering. And she let herself shiver for real, too. The warehouse was cold enough that it cost her nothing to fake what her body was already doing. Plastic against aluminum, friction, patience. The same quality that made her good at finding a single false entry buried in 10,000 lines of a ledger was the quality keeping her alive right now. The refusal to stop looking for the flaw. The tie gave, almost silently, somewhere around what she guessed was 11 o'clock. She didn't move. Moving now, with 3 men in the room and 1 hour left on whatever clock Adrian was operating under, would get her shot before it got her free. So she sat there with her wrists technically loose inside the broken tie, hands still folded behind her like nothing had changed. And she waited. And she listened to Curtis complain to the nervous one about a card game he'd lost money on. And she thought about Adrian's face the last time she saw it. Not at the gala, not in the bedroom doorway. The last time. In the bakery doorway, sunlight behind him, before any of this. Outside, 4 miles north, Adrian was loading a second magazine into a pistol he hadn't fired outside a range in 6 years, and his hands were not steady, and he hated that they weren't steady. And Marcus, beside him in the back of an armored SUV, watched him fight his own grip and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to a man 40 minutes from finding out if his wife was alive. 3 exits confirmed, Marcus said instead. Voice clipped, professional. The only register that helped right now. Loading dock east side, that's where their trucks go. Heaviest presence. Personnel door north side, 2 men minimum. Roof access via a fire ladder on the west wall. No confirmed coverage, that's our way in. Felix's sister. Office block, 2nd floor, northeast corner. 1 guard, according to Felix, rotates every 40 minutes. Marcus's jaw tightened. We get her first. Closest entry point, smallest resistance. Then we move on Evelyn. No. Adrian's voice didn't leave room for argument. We move together. 2 teams, simultaneous breach, north and roof, same 60-second window. I'm not staggering this and giving them time to use one hostage as leverage for the other. That splits our force in a building we don't have full eyes on. Then we make do with the eyes we've got, Adrian said, because the alternative is a girl bleeding out while we finish clearing a hallway for my wife. And I will not live with that math, Marcus. Not tonight. Behind them, in 3 more vehicles running dark, 22 men checked weapons in silence. Men who'd spent years in Adrian's employ for exactly this kind of night and had hoped, mostly, never to see it. Danny sat in the last car against every order given to him, having refused so completely and so loudly that Adrian had finally relented on the condition he stayed in the vehicle, unarmed, useless except as a body that could run toward his sister the second it was safe to. It was not going to be safe for a long time. At 11:40, the patient one with the knife stood up, stretched, and said something to Curtis that made Curtis laugh. And in that half second of distraction, in that exact sliver of inattention, Evelyn's wrist came free behind her back and her right hand closed around the edge of the chair seat, steadying, and her heart began hammering so hard she was sure they'd hear it across the room. She didn't move yet. Moving too early was how people died in situations like this. She'd read enough, somewhere, sometime, some article about hostage psychology she'd never expected to need. Moving too early meant moving without an opening. So she waited, breath shallow, every muscle coiled, watching the patient one settle back onto his crate, watching the nervous one's eyes drift back down to his phone screen, watching Curtis turn his back to check something on a clipboard hanging by the door. That was the opening. 3 seconds, maybe 4. She came off the chair low and fast, no hesitation, the same decisive motion she used when she finally saw the lie buried in a column of numbers and knew exactly where to cut. Straight at the nervous one, the weakest link, the one whose attention had drifted furthest. Her shoulder hit his midsection before he'd even registered movement, and they went down together, his phone skittering across the concrete, his breath leaving him in a startled grunt. And Evelyn's hand found the knife at his belt before his hands found anything at all. "Hey!" Curtis was turning, clipboard falling, hand going for his weapon. Evelyn didn't think. She didn't have the luxury of thinking. She drove the knife into the meat of the nervous one's thigh. Not a killing strike. She wasn't capable of that. Not yet. But enough to make him scream and curl away from her. Enough to buy 3 seconds. And she was already moving, scrambling up, lunging for the gap between the crate stacks where she'd spent the last hour memorizing a path with nothing to do but stare and calculate. A shot cracked off the concrete inches from her head, close enough that dust and stone fragments stung her cheek, and she didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran, lungs burning, bare feet. They'd taken her shoes. She registered that now for the first time, distantly, irrelevantly, slapping against cold concrete as she put a steel support column between herself and the gunfire. "She's loose!" Curtis was shouting, somewhere behind her, voice climbing toward panic. "She's loose! Get eyes on the east side! Get eyes on her!" The warehouse, which had been holding its breath in dim, patient silence for hours, exploded into motion. The roof access went first, 4 men dropping through a skylight Marcus's intel had flagged as the weakest point in the building's coverage, and the sound of it, glass, impact, the brief ugly percussion of a struggle ended fast and permanently, rolled through the structure like a starting gun. 30 seconds later, the north personnel door went down off its hinges, Adrian first through it, weapon up, every cell in his body screaming her name, even though his mouth stayed locked in the grim, silent discipline Marcus had drilled into him 20 years ago. The warehouse interior was chaos by the time Adrian's boots hit the concrete floor. Gunfire from somewhere east, shouting, the particular electric confusion of a defense that had no time to organize because the attack had come faster than anyone inside had planned for. Adrian's men fanned out in pairs, clearing corners, and Adrian moved through the center of it like a man who'd stopped caring whether he survived the night, only whether she did. He found Curtis first, mid-stride, weapon rising toward something Adrian couldn't see yet, and he didn't hesitate, didn't announce himself, just put 2 rounds into the man's chest from 12 feet and kept moving without breaking stride, stepping over the body like it was furniture. "Evelyn!" His voice tore out of him, raw, desperate, abandoning every ounce of discipline at once. "Evelyn, where are you?" A scream answered him from somewhere east, high and furious and unmistakably hers, followed by a sound like a body hitting metal, and Adrian's blood went to ice and then to fire in the same half-second, and he ran toward it faster than he'd run in his entire adult life. Evelyn had made it 40 feet before the patient one caught her. He didn't grab her the way Curtis had tried to. Sloppy, panicked. He came at her with the same unbothered calm he'd shown cleaning his nails on the crate, like the gunfire and the chaos exploding through the building were simply weather he intended to wait out, and his hand closed around her hair from behind and yanked her backward off her feet with brutal, practiced efficiency. She hit the concrete hard, the air slamming out of her lungs, and the knife she'd been clutching skittered away into the dark beyond a stack of pallets. "You're a fighter," the patient one said, almost admiring, crouching over her, knife back in his hand, the blade catching what little light there was. Most of them just cry. You actually tried something. Shame, it's not going to matter. Evelyn's vision swam, lungs fighting to refill, and through the ringing in her ears she heard gunfire closing from two directions, heard her own name being screamed somewhere in the building in a voice she'd know anywhere, and something in her, not training, not calculation this time, just pure animal refusal, drove her hand into a loose chunk of broken concrete beside her on the floor. She swung it into the side of his head with everything she had left. It wasn't enough to drop him cleanly. He reeled, cursed, blood opening above his ear. But it was enough to buy her a half-second. And a half-second was all Adrian needed, because he came around the stack of pallets at a dead run, weapon already rising, and the patient one turned toward the sound a fraction too late. Adrian didn't shoot him. Not yet. He hit him instead. Full speed, shoulder first, the two of them crashing into a rack of steel shelving that came down around them in a shriek of metal and a hail of dropped tools. And the gun went flying from Adrian's hand on impact. And what followed wasn't a fight with rules. It was two men trying to kill each other with whatever was within reach. The patient one still had his knife. He drove it toward Adrian's ribs in a fast, economical motion that spoke of real training, and Adrian twisted half a second too late, felt the blade open a line of fire along his side instead of finding anything vital, and the pain was so total and so immediate that for a moment the entire warehouse went white at the edges. He didn't stop moving. He grabbed the man's wrist, drove it down and sideways against the edge of a fallen shelf, hard enough to hear the bone give, and the knife clattered free. And then it was just hands. Adrian's fists, again and again, all the fear of the last 22 hours pouring out of him in a rhythm that had nothing left of careful calculation in it at all, until the man beneath him stopped moving and Marcus's hand closed hard on his shoulder, hauling him back before he killed someone they might need alive for information. Adrian, he's down. He's done. You need to... Marcus's voice cut off as he saw the blood soaking through Adrian's shirt at the ribs. You're hit. I'm fine. Adrian was already turning, already searching the wreckage of collapsed shelving with eyes gone wild, and then he saw her, pressed against the base of a support column, knees drawn up, blood on her hands that wasn't hers, eyes huge and locked on him like she couldn't fully believe what she was looking at. And every wall he'd built around himself in 34 years of surviving this exact kind of life came down at once. Evelyn. Her name came out broken. Nothing left of the controlled man who'd negotiated her into a marriage contract 4 months ago in a room with no windows. He dropped to his knees in front of her, hands hovering, afraid to touch her and afraid not to. Are you hurt? Tell me where you're hurt. I'm okay. Her voice shook badly, but her hands found his face, his jaw, like she needed to confirm with her own fingers that he was real and not another fever dream of the last 22 hours. I'm okay, Adrian. I got free before they... The rest of the sentence died in her throat as a new sound rolled through the warehouse. Heavier gunfire, a different cadence than before, coming from the office block on the second floor where Felix's sister was being held, and both their heads turned toward it at once. And somewhere above the chaos, a man's voice rose in fury that Adrian recognized instantly because he'd heard it just 3 days ago, in a ballroom, right before he put that man's face into a marble bar. Silas Draven hadn't been at the bakery. He hadn't been at the negotiation drop point either. He'd been here the entire time, in the one place none of Adrian's intelligence had flagged, watching his own operation collapse floor by floor. And now, with his hostage taken and his men dying around him, he was done waiting for midnight. Get him up here! Draven's voice roared down through the building, raw with a fury that had nothing left to lose in it. Vale! You want your wife's wedding ring back? Come get it yourself. I've got another girl up here who's going to learn exactly what happens to people who stand next to you. Adrian's hands, cupping Evelyn's face, went rigid. Felix's sister, he said, and the words came out flat, final, a man doing the only math left that mattered. He pressed one hard kiss to Evelyn's forehead, fast, desperate, a promise he had no time to put into words, and rose to his feet with blood soaking through his shirt and a stranger's blood drying on his knuckles. Marcus, get her out of the building. Get her to the cars. Do not let her follow me. Adrian, no.
Evelyn was on her feet too, swaying, refusing. I'm not leaving you to go up there alone. You're bleeding. You can barely. I can do anything I need to do tonight. Adrian's eyes found hers, and whatever softness had been there a moment ago was gone, replaced by something colder, harder. The version of himself the entire Midwest underworld had spent years learning to fear, and for the first time since she'd met him, Evelyn understood she wasn't looking at a man playing a part anymore. I let one man humiliate himself in front of me at a party and call it finished. I'm not making that mistake twice. Silas Draven is done tonight. One way or the other, he doesn't walk out of this building.
He picked up a fallen weapon from the wreckage, checked the magazine with hands that had finally, terribly, gone steady, and started toward the stairwell at the back of the warehouse, toward the second floor, toward the sound of Draven's voice still echoing through the structure, toward a confrontation that both men had been building toward since the moment a champagne glass froze in midair at a charity gala 3 weeks ago. And behind him, Evelyn stood in the wreckage of her own captivity, blood on her hands, fear and fury tangled together in her chest in equal, unbearable measure, and made a decision of her own. She was not going to wait in a car while he walked up those stairs alone. The stairwell smelled like rust and gun smoke, and Adrian took the steps 2 at a time with blood loosening its grip down his side, every breath costing him more than the last. And he did not stop, because stopping was a luxury that belonged to men who had something left to lose besides the one thing already at the top of those stairs. He came through the second-floor doorway low and fast, weapon up, and the office block opened in front of him. Fluorescent light, water-stained ceiling tiles, 2 of Draven's men already down near the entrance, cut apart by Adrian's advance team minutes earlier, and at the far end, framed by a single swinging bulb, Silas Draven stood with one arm locked around the throat of a girl who couldn't have been more than 17, his other hand pressing a pistol hard enough against her temple that her whole body had gone rigid with the effort of not flinching away from the metal. "There he is," Draven said, and his voice had lost every trace of the smug, oily confidence he'd worn at the gala. What was left was raw, manic, a man who'd watched his entire operation collapse in 20 minutes and had nothing left but the one card he hadn't played yet. Blood crusted dark along his hairline where Evelyn's chunk of concrete had opened him up earlier. One eye had swollen nearly shut. "Look at you, bleeding all over my floor. You couldn't even wait for midnight like a man with manners." "Let her go, Silas." Adrian's voice carried across the room flat and level, weapon trained, finger resting along the guard. Not the trigger, not yet. "This is between us. It was always between us. The girl's got nothing to do with it." "The girl's got everything to do with it." Draven's grip tightened and the girl made a small, terrified sound that cut through Adrian worse than any threat could have. "Felix sold me her schedule because I had his sister. Felix's sister is the only leverage I've got left in this entire building, Vale. So don't stand there and tell me she's got nothing to do with it. She's the only thing keeping me breathing in the next 60 seconds. "You're wrong." The voice came from behind Adrian, from the stairwell, breathless, and his stomach dropped through the floor even before he turned his head, because he knew that voice better than his own pulse now, and it was the last voice he wanted to hear in this building. Evelyn stepped into the doorway, bare feet, blood-streaked hands, hair wild, chest heaving from the stairs, and Draven's swollen face split into something that might have been a smile if a smile could be made entirely of hatred. "Well," Draven said, almost delighted, almost relieved, like a man who'd just been handed back the hand he thought he'd lost. "There's my actual leverage. Mrs. Vale. You really are a fighter, aren't you? Curtis said so right before you put a knife in his friend's leg." His eyes flicked to Adrian, and something ugly and triumphant crossed his ruined face. "Drop the gun, Vale, or I put a bullet in this girl and find out exactly how fast you can close 15 feet before I put the next one in your wife." "Adrian, don't." Evelyn's voice cracked. "Don't you dare drop it for me. Don't you dare—" "Quiet," Draven snapped, and the gun shifted half an inch, an unconscious tell. His attention split now between 2 targets instead of 1, and Adrian saw it happen. Saw the exact moment Draven's focus fractured, the gun barrel drifting a fraction off the girl's temple as his head turned toward Evelyn, and 20 years of training collapsed into a single half-second decision. He didn't drop the gun. He raised it the final 2 inches and fired. The shot took Draven through the shoulder of the arm holding the pistol, and the gun spun loose from suddenly useless fingers, clattering across the concrete, and the girl wrenched free of his slackened grip and threw herself sideways, sobbing, scrambling toward the stairs on hands and knees. Draven staggered back against a filing cabinet, clutching the ruin of his shoulder, face contorted with a pain that finally, completely, stripped away every last trace of the man who'd stood in a ballroom 3 weeks ago, believing himself untouchable. Adrian crossed the room before Draven's knees fully buckled. He didn't shoot again. He grabbed Draven by what was left of his collar and forced him upright, forced him to stand on legs that didn't want to hold him, and dragged him toward the catwalk railing that ran along the office block's open second story, overlooking the warehouse floor below where the last of his men were finishing the last of Draven's. "You wanted a war," Adrian said, voice low, almost gentle, the same terrible quiet he'd used on this exact man 3 weeks earlier with a different kind of violence in his hands. "You got one. You lost it in under 30 minutes, Silas. Your men are dead or dying on that floor. Your operation's finished. The council's going to hear by morning that you tried to use a hostage to extort territory and got beaten by a man with half your manpower and twice your reason to win. Do it then." Draven spat blood onto the catwalk grating, defiant even now, even broken. "Finish it. Prove you're exactly what they all say you are." Adrian looked at him for a long moment, at the blood, the swollen eye, the shoulder wound already soaking through expensive fabric, and something in his face shifted, some final calculation completing itself behind those flat, controlled eyes. "No," Adrian said. "I'm not going to kill you." Draven's working eye widened, confusion cutting through the pain. "I'm going to let the council kill you," Adrian said, "after I make sure every single one of them hears exactly what you did tonight. That you took a man's pregnant?" He caught himself, the words slipping out before he'd fully processed it himself, an instinctive, hopeful slip he didn't have time to examine. "That you took an innocent woman hostage to extort territory. That you used a 17-year-old girl as a human shield. That you broke every rule this organization has ever pretended to operate by. They didn't mind that you wanted my territory, Silas. They'll mind very much how you went about trying to take it. You're not dying tonight a martyr. You're dying in 3 weeks at a council tribunal, disgraced, abandoned by every crew that ever owed you a favor, and every single person in this city is going to know exactly why." He let go. Draven crumpled against the railing, defeated in a way that had nothing to do with the bullet in his shoulder. "Apologize," Adrian said quietly, "to my wife." Draven's working eye found Evelyn across the room, where she stood with Felix's sister now gathered against her side, both of them shaking, both of them alive. "I'm sorry," Draven said. The words dragged out of him in a voice gone hollow with defeat, and this time there was nothing performed about the humiliation in it at all. Adrian turned away from him without another word, crossed the office block floor, and Evelyn met him halfway, colliding into him with a force that should have hurt his ribs and somehow only steadied something in his chest instead. He wrapped his arms around her, one hand cradling the back of her head, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, just breathed, just held on, two people who had both, in their own way, almost lost everything in the same 24 hours. "You came up those stairs," Adrian said into her hair, voice wrecked. "I told Marcus to keep you in the car." "I was never going to sit in a car while you walked up here alone." Evelyn pulled back just far enough to look at him. Blood and dust streaked across both their faces, and something in her expression had changed permanently in the last day. Some final wall come down. "You don't get to do that, not anymore. Whatever this is, Adrian, whatever we've turned into, it doesn't work if you keep trying to survive things alone." "I don't know how to do it any other way." His voice broke on the admission, raw and unguarded in a way she'd never heard from him. Not even in the kitchen at midnight, not even in the hospital hallway with Felix's confession still hanging in the air. "I've been doing it alone since I was younger than that girl you just pulled off that stairwell. I don't know what it looks like to not do it alone." "Then let me show you," Evelyn said, and kissed him, there in the wreckage of the warehouse. Blood and smoke, and the distant sound of sirens finally arriving too late to matter. And it wasn't gentle, and it wasn't romantic in any way a person watching from a distance would have recognized. But it was real.
the first thing between them that had been entirely real from the very beginning, with nothing left to perform for anyone.
The weeks that followed unspooled slowly, the way things do after violence. Not a clean ending, but a long, uneven climb back toward something that resembled normal life. Felix recovered from his head wound in the same hospital wing as his sister, who needed 3 weeks and a great deal of quiet patience before she stopped flinching at sudden movement. Adrian visited them both. He didn't forgive easily. It wasn't in his nature, and Evelyn didn't ask him to pretend otherwise. But he paid for every bill the hospital generated, relocated Felix's sister and their mother somewhere far outside Draven's old territory, and told Felix, in a conversation Evelyn wasn't present for but heard about from Marcus afterward, that loyalty broken under torture wasn't the same thing as loyalty sold for profit, and that there might, someday, be a way back, though it would take longer than either of them wanted it to. The council tribunal happened exactly as Adrian had promised. Silas Draven, stripped of territory, allies, and the protection his name had once afforded him, stood in front of the same old men who'd demanded Adrian marry for optics 4 months earlier, and watched his entire life's work get divided among rivals who'd been waiting years for exactly this opportunity. Nobody at that tribunal mentioned mercy. Adrian didn't ask for any on Draven's behalf, but he also didn't lobby for blood, and when the council's decision was rendered, exile, not execution, territory stripped, name permanently marked as untrustworthy across every crew from Chicago to St. Louis, Adrian accepted it without comment and went home to his wife instead of staying to watch the rest. Danny got a job, a real one, unglamorous, at a logistics company 3 of Adrian's legitimate holdings did business with, nothing connected to the world that had nearly gotten him killed, and he started therapy on his own initiative without anyone pushing him toward it, and the first time Evelyn saw him laugh again, really laugh, not the brittle, performed kind he'd been doing for years to cover the panic underneath, she had to leave the room so he wouldn't see her cry about it. Their mother never learned the truth. That had been Evelyn's one condition from the very first conversation in that nameless room above a restaurant, and Adrian had kept it, even through everything, even when keeping it meant constructing an elaborate cover story about a security scare at her old apartment to explain the relocation. As far as she knew, her daughter had married a successful, somewhat private businessman, and her son had finally gotten his life together, and the family had simply gotten luckier than they deserved. Evelyn let her believe it. Some kindnesses, she'd decided, weren't lies. They were just love wearing a different coat. What? The marriage contract sat in a drawer in Adrian's office for 3 months after the warehouse, untouched, neither of them quite ready to look at it directly, both of them aware of what it represented and unwilling to disturb the fragile, real thing growing in its shadow. It was Adrian who finally took it out. He found Evelyn in the kitchen. The same counter, months of midnight conversations layered into that marble-like sediment, and set the folded document down in front of her without a word, then crossed to the small crystal ashtray Rosa kept on the windowsill for reasons nobody quite remembered, a decorative leftover from some previous owner of the house. "What are you doing?" Evelyn asked, though something in her chest already knew. "The debt's gone. Danny's safe. Draven's finished." Adrian struck a match, the small flame trembling slightly in his hand. Still, after everything, a man capable of trembling, which she'd learned was not the same thing as a man capable of weakness. There's no reason for this to exist anymore. No reason for either of us to be bound by a contract neither of us has honored in the way it was written. He held the flame to the corner of the document. The paper caught slowly, curling black at the edges, and he dropped it into the ashtray and watched it burn down to nothing. 3 years of obligation reduced to a thin curl of smoke disappearing into the kitchen's high ceiling. "You're free," Adrian said, not looking at her, his voice carefully, deliberately even. The same flat control he'd used in that first meeting 4 months ago, except this time she could hear what it was costing him to maintain it. "Whatever you want now, a settlement, a clean exit, your own life somewhere far from all of this, I'll make sure you have it. You don't owe me anything else. You never really did, not after the first month, but especially not now." Evelyn looked at the ash settling in the crystal dish, at the man standing across the kitchen from her with his shoulders braced like he was waiting for a verdict he already expected to lose, and something in her chest that had been quietly, steadily filling for 4 months, finally, completely, overflowed. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked. "No." The word came out before he could stop it, raw, immediate, stripped of every careful performance he'd ever built around himself. "God, no, Evelyn, I don't want—" He stopped himself, jaw tight, visibly furious at his own inability to finish the sentence cleanly, this man who'd once negotiated her entire future across a table without blinking. "I want you to stay because you want to stay, not because of a contract, not because of a debt, not because there's nowhere else for you to go. I need it to be a choice, because everything else in my life has been an arrangement, and I don't think I could survive you being one more thing I acquired instead of one thing I was actually given." Evelyn crossed the kitchen, the same distance she'd crossed 100 times over 4 months of midnight conversations that had quietly become the realest thing in either of their lives, and took his face in both hands the way she had the night he told her about his mother, the night something in him had first cracked open enough to let her see what was underneath all that careful stillness. "I'm choosing you," she said. "No contract, no deadline, no conditions. I watched you walk up those stairs to save a girl who wasn't even yours to save, and I understood something about you I think I'd known for weeks, and was too scared to say out loud. You were never the man they told stories about in that ballroom. You were always this. You just didn't think anyone would stay long enough to find out." Adrian's breath left him in something that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, some unguarded sound from a place he'd kept locked for longer than she'd been alive, and he pulled her against his chest and held on like a man finally, after 34 years, allowing himself to believe that something good could simply be his without a price attached. 1 year later, Chicago's most prestigious charity gala fell into a hush the moment Adrian and Evelyn Vale walked through the doors hand in hand, and this time the silence carried nothing of threat in it at all. Evelyn wore crimson, a color she'd never have chosen for herself a year earlier, back when quiet elegance felt safer than being seen, and the dress moved with her in soft, deliberate folds around the gentle curve of a 7-month pregnancy she carried with a calm, settled confidence that had nothing left to prove to anyone in that room. Adrian's hand stayed at the small of her back, not as a stage direction this time, not as theater for an audience that needed convincing, but simply because he liked having it there. Because some habits built in crisis had quietly become habits built in peace instead. No one in that ballroom remembered the fragile-looking accountant Silas Draven had once mocked as too delicate for this world. They saw instead a woman who'd walked through fire and come out the other side steadier than she'd gone in, who'd once found the flaw in a locked room full of armed men and used it to buy herself the seconds that mattered, who had, in the end, needed no rescuing at all. Only a partner willing to meet her halfway through the wreckage. Danny was there too, 3 tables back, sober a year now, sitting beside a woman from his therapy group he'd been quietly, nervously dating for 2 months, and hadn't yet found the courage to introduce to his sister properly. Felix worked security at the door, fully reinstated after 8 months of rebuilding trust one shift at a time. His sister safely enrolled in college 4 states away, finally, slowly, learning to sleep through the night again. Late in the evening, when the speeches were finished and the music had softened into something easier, Adrian found Evelyn by the same bar where, 1 year and a lifetime ago, he'd put a man's face into marble for daring to call her fragile. He didn't say anything at first. He just took her hand, rested his palm flat against the curve where their daughter was waiting to arrive into a world that had finally, hard-won, become safe enough to hold her. "I used to think this life had no room for anything soft in it," Adrian said quietly, watching the room glitter and turn around them. Men who'd once feared him now simply nodding respectfully as they passed, no longer wondering what kind of monster had married a woman too delicate for their world. "I was wrong about a lot of things that night at the bakery. I think that was the first one." Evelyn leaned into him, his arms settling around her shoulders, the weight of a year's survival folded quietly into the simple, unremarkable comfort of standing beside someone who had chosen to stay. "You weren't wrong," she said. "You were just waiting for someone stubborn enough to prove it." Outside, Chicago's skyline burned gold against a clear October sky, indifferent to the war that had once been fought beneath it, indifferent to the empire that had nearly fractured, and instead, against every reasonable expectation, had found something steadier to stand on. Inside, two people who had survived the worst version of each other's world stood together in the quiet aftermath of everything, no longer pretending, no longer performing, simply present. And for the first time in either of their lives, that was enough.